and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I'm pleased to have with me on the show today, Ray Wojcik. Hi, Ray. Thanks a lot for being here today.
Great to be here, Suzanne.
Ray has lived and worked in Poland for over 11 years now, working in embassy defense cooperation as an attaché, and most recently with the Center for European Policy Analysis, where he's currently a non-resident senior fellow as part of the Transatlantic Defense and Security team. Ray focuses on defense and security issues connected with the Eastern Flank. Ray and I both participate on a regular basis in a trilateral dialogue between Germany, the United States, and Poland, now organized primarily by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And we talk about the security of NATO's Eastern Flank, which is the topic of today's podcast. So I wanted to ask Ray several questions about that topic, which is very prominent today and very topical. So first, how about you tell us a little bit about CEPA and your role there as a non-resident senior fellow of the Transatlantic Defense and Security team?
Okay, and thanks again, Suzanne, for putting this project together, inviting CEPA to be a partner with you on this one. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. So CEPA, is a think tank that started relatively new, still in the longer span of think tanks, started about 15 years ago, with a mission to tighten the transatlantic bonds between basically the newer emerging NATO nations and EU nations on NATO's eastern flank. If you think about the B9 countries, or if you think about everything sort of between Berlin and Moscow, so B9 and all the other former Soviet states, and Russia and so forth, and NATO partners, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, that's the region that we focus on. So when I was invited to CEPA after working in Poland so many years, I was very excited because I feel like it's at the heart of what I'm most interested in is in improving the U.S. relationship with these nations and transatlantic bonds. And that is exactly the CEPA mission, basically Berlin to Moscow, and tightening those transatlantic bonds, reinforcing democratic values, and increasing defense and security capabilities. So that's the CEPA mission, and the CEPA vision is to continue the larger European project, European whole, free, and at peace with itself. And CEPA's role in that is the probably overarching CEPA mission, but we focus on this region, and again, the one I'm most interested in.
That's great. And so the Eastern Flank is a topic that you work with a lot. And so, in your opinion, why is it such a hot topic these days? Is it are we really facing a huge threat by Russia in this region, or why is it so important in the security sector to discuss the Eastern Flank?
Well, you have to go back to more recent history, a little bit farther back into the late 80s, early 90s, when the fall of the Soviet Union, and finally the release of these captive states that were trapped at the end of World War II, and getting the former Warsaw Pact states and some of the independent states that were, again, trapped behind the Iron Curtain, back into Western democracy potential, the ability to join NATO, the European Union, and then also strengthen their bonds with the United States. So with that, what we see in the 90s and early 2000s with the post-Soviet Union, Russia. And the Russian Federation initially was weakened, of course, by the fall of the Soviet Union, and was a little bit, let's say, unsteered for over a decade, very strongly. And then President Vladimir Putin came along and things changed. And so since that time, and what we've really seen increasingly since about 2014, is a revisionist Russia, threatening its neighbors, using political warfare, economic warfare, energy warfare, disinfo, cyber attacks, and then real hard security threats, whether it's simulated nuclear attacks on allies and partners, or nuclear threats to allies and partners, strengthening everything between the Barents and Black Sea and the Mediterranean, fighting proxy wars in the region. Those kinds of things have totally changed the dynamic. Those are real threats felt very, very strongly with our allies and partners in the region. And that's one of the things I think we'll talk about a little bit later about threat perception. That remains an issue for the West and for NATO to sort out how we really see Russia. But my perspective, SIPA's perspective, Russia a real physical threat, and Russia a real soft power threat in the region to our allies and partners.
Thank you for that explanation. But yes, indeed, the threat perception among the allies is something rather challenging these days. So as you mentioned, countries located in the region on the eastern flank oftentimes are perhaps have a heightened threat perception of Russia based on their history, as you so well explained. But then other countries in Europe, maybe in the south or in the west, don't share the same history and may not share the same view. So in your opinion, do the Allies share the common threat perception on Russia, or are they kind of disunited on that front? And if so, what explains that?
Mm-hmm. The answer is yes and yes to both. So on the positive side, the Allies have actually, because of the response we've seen in the region by NATO especially, but not only by EU sanctions on Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine and so forth, those demonstrate that there is some base level of understanding of the threat of Russia and what Russia has been doing, either below the table, as General Breedlove, so eloquently refers to all that, the below the table tools the Russians use, and the above board physical present threats Russia projects in the region. So on the good side, there is some base level understanding among NATO and the EU. On the downside, though, NATO is made up, and so is the EU, of course, of dozens of democratic states with different histories, as you mentioned, different views, different relationships with Russia. So even on the eastern flank, where you would think there would be a lot more solidarity, among the NATO allies, we have a significant divergence when we get to the Black Sea region on the threat perception about Russia. So just on the eastern flank, of course, when we get to the Western allies with larger economic military potential and a strategic depth difference than the frontline states, we talk about France and Germany and so on, totally different perception on especially the real military threat, whether it's a military capability, but it's more about, from their perspective, it's more about the political and the will for Russia to prosecute some kind of campaign on the eastern flank. Even the allies on the eastern flank, truly, nobody really thinks tomorrow the Russians are going to invade Lithuania or Estonia or Poland, but they want to set the conditions that Russia never thinks twice about using that as a tool. They use all these other tools, as I mentioned, below the belt, but we want to show by our deterrence and defensive strength that we're standing up and ready to thwart that. So the challenge remains these threat perceptions. We've argued in our recent report that SIPA put out on the eastern flank. It's called One Flank, One Threat, One Presence. And that report is all about coherence of our approach to eastern flank defense and security, but as well in the rest of Europe, the Western Alliance, getting a common view on threat perception. It's very hard to do, something that has to be attacked, something NATO has to address. And we need more interaction. This trilat you mentioned is one of the formats that can sort of help develop that common threat perception. That format you mentioned, Germany, Poland, the United States, allows those three very, very important allies to this region to come together to help, in my view, to help ensure the Germans really understand what the avenues of approach are, what the force ratios are on the eastern flank, and what the Russian continued demonstrable activities are, because there's really a gap, or I don't know if you want to call it sort of head in the sand or hope, hope that the Russians won't do anything, but that's what it seems like in the western, when you get west of the Polish western border, it seems like there's a hope sort of sense of what the Russians are going to do in the future. So it needs to be addressed. Smaller formats is a way to do it. NATO needs to tackle this itself. They need to find new ways to fully engage the sort of B9 or the Eastern Flank allies, get Turkey more on board with these threat model developments, and work to ensure that we understand the common threat picture. Because if we don't do that, that's the basic level of building coherence in our response. And again, you can see there's clearly quite a bit of coherence because of the response we've demonstrated, but there needs to be much more, and the Russians will continue to keep us on the back of our heels until we get that coherence and includes the threat analysis and threat models, and then the response to our posture response, let's say, to those threats.
Well, that was a very comprehensive answer, but I'm curious though, how come we're focusing so much on the Baltic Sea rather than the Black Sea? I mean, Russia recently annexed Crimea and has a base in Sevastopol and has used the Black Sea region to help its activities in Syria, and also has militarily been involved in Ukraine and Georgia. So everything is kind of focused in that region. So why is the eastern flank around the Baltic Sea receiving so much more attention? And do you think that that's wise for NATO? And which region do you think is strategically more important for Russia in the end?
Yeah, so it's sort of the weakest link approach to the eastern flank. A lot of turmoil politically in the with the allies and partners in the Black Sea region. One of the earlier, we just go back to 2014, use that as a little bit of a starting point. Really, the starting point, you have to go back to occupation of Moldova, in my view, and then Georgia, attacks, cyber attacks in Estonia, those kinds of things that happened before 2010. But when you fast forward, you know, those things happened. NATO was maybe slowly waking up to this revisionist Russia, but by 2014, it was absolutely clear what Russia did in Ukraine. Now, NATO's response, again, showed a lot of solidarity and coherence, and the EU with the sanctions. But what happened was there was kind of a two-tiered approach to the Baltic theater and to the Black Sea theater. And basically, we took what was called an enhanced forward presence view of the Baltics, which is a much more specific response and positioning of forces continuously in the Baltic region. And then in the southeastern region, Black Sea, we took a response mechanism that we called a tailored forward presence, which meant a little bit more ad hoc. We weren't exactly sure which ally was going to come and help Romania and Bulgaria and Black Sea air policing next time. Where up in the Baltics, it was very concrete. Now, one of the differences initially viewed in 2014 was the most vulnerable, especially for land, ground combat areas in the whole eastern flank, was a small strip of land we call the Suwalki corridor that divides or is at the Polish-Lithuanian border. And so NATO saw that clearly as a weak link to easily seal off three allies, but the Russians could easily close that corridor. And so NATO went after that very hard. And meanwhile, the Kaliningrad had already been strengthened over years and years, and now was getting strengthened further and further. What was happening in Crimea and Donbass was happening, but it was happening more slowly. NATO's watching, EU is reacting. So there isn't this sort of strong response that happened in the Baltic Sea. And again, because of that ability for the Russians to instantly cut off three allies and then use Belarus as a natural platform between Belarus through Lithuania to Kaliningrad to basically run a major campaign against NATO in the Northeast. So NATO responded to that. The other part of this is up until that time, NATO very much still trying to find its way post all the NATO expansions. We still have limited NATO expansion going, the growth and enlargement of NATO, which is awesome to see North Macedonia and Montenegro come in the last few years. But, you know, NATO has been struggling. We can clearly see in its defense spending overall, in its debate about missions abroad versus territorial defense. And so NATO was struggling with all these internal issues, always trying to improve its capabilities, but not being sure of the full mission set that was required. So that was a problem. So that sort of limitation to NATO, this what are we all about during this period, led to we need to close this Putin's gap. We called it the Suwalki corridor, what we wanted to keep open, and Putin's gap to close. We wanted to prevent Putin from even thinking about that. And then we were going to put sort of ad hoc approach in the Black Sea, keep it, let Putin know we were there and we cared. But it wasn't to the level that it should have been done. And clearly today, and that's something CEPA very strongly argues for, is a much more strengthened posture in the Black Sea region. And so overall, just to button up this question for you, overall, CEPA's approach to the eastern flank is we need to get away from enhanced forward presence in the Baltic, sort of philosophically, and down in the Black Sea, tailored forward presence. We need to have a forward presence on NATO's eastern flank that's coherent, balanced, and responds to the threats that the Russian poses.
All right, so let's go back to the region of Poland, where you are and where you live. Tell us a little bit more about the current U.S.-Polish relationship, and are making agreements on defense and upping U.S. presence in Poland, as Poland is as threat perception, as you know, is quite heightened these days. But there seems to be a perception, at least, that perhaps the United States and Poland are making bilateral decisions on defense. Do you think that this is affecting the trust within NATO, or is that just a misperception, actually, and that's not at all what's going on? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so from my perspective, all this in the bilateral sphere is good news. It's good news for Poland and the United States, good news for NATO. And I think this is not necessarily unusual that there's special, specific bilateral or sometimes trilateral, as we talked about earlier, efforts going on. Because in the smaller formats often, or even bilaterally, of course, it's easier to get things done and get things done quickly. So in the case of the United States and Poland, U.S. relationship, in my view, has been pretty much very, very strong, for more than 200 years. So there's been, of course, interruptions when Poland was trapped behind the Iron Curtain. But from the beginning of the U.S. Effort for independence, Polish support to that, and then you go into the early 20th century with 25,000 Americans supporting Polish independence in the battle for Warsaw in the Soviet-Polish War. There's all these different episodes. And of course, Polish significant support to the West. It's the fourth largest Allied force in World War II. It's often forgotten that the escaped Polish forces, either to the east under Soviet banner or to the west under British flag, brought in next to the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain, the fourth largest Allied contributing army. But again, Poland lost everything at the end of that period. And we get into the 1990s when Poland breaks away from the foot of the Soviet Union. Poland immediately rivets towards the West, and especially the United States. So what we're seeing today, as your comment about that defense security agreement, is long pattern of longer history, but specifically since 1989, Poland's hard turn to the West and towards the United States. And with that, Poland showed significant commitment every step of the way, every opportunity, whether it was supporting us in Desert Storm already by 1990, 1991, supporting us in Haiti in our operations there, supporting us in the Balkans and NATO in the Balkans fight, significantly capturing Serbian war criminals, for example. And then by 2002, the fourth or the third ally that would even show up on the day one of operations in Afghanistan. It was Poland. It was Poland, the UK, and Australia, the only three allies that showed up right next to us in operations in Afghanistan in 2002. And then by 2003, same thing, a repeat. Australia, UK, and Poland. So out of the rest of the alliance, whether they had the capability or political will, those didn't match. For Poland, they matched. Now, so when we go into more recent times with the advent or the Russian revisionism, Poland has been a leader in the region, pushing all kinds of tough initiatives to convince NATO and the United States, really, to strengthen the eastern flank. So Poland's really been a leader on sort of getting the discussion going of what needs to happen, providing their sort of, let's say, ideas on what the posture should look like, and those have varied over the last 10 years, and then working those out. And of course, the key player, the army that showed up immediately in the wake of the Russian attacks in Crimea, was the United States. So the United States showed up early in April of 2014. And in March of 2014, the U.S. showed up with aircraft, and by April, we showed up with soldiers. And Poland recognized that, and Poland recognized that the major player and influencer for NATO writ large, the big leader, is the United States, and the United States took the lead on the eastern flank. Poland is the leader, let's say, on the eastern flank, both capability and political will, took the reins of trying to cement that even closer. And over the last 6 or 7 years, has worked hard with the United States to get to these agreements that we're at now. They really came about in the last year and a half. There's been two different declarations, and then this agreement you mentioned called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which has sort of codified the U.S. posture that's going to be continuous in Poland for the extended future. So I don't think those have any negative impact on allied relationships in the region. For example, just imagine 2019, when Poland actually was being criticized for doing exactly what you said, doing these close discussions with the United States. Why wasn't NATO involved? Some in Western NATO were, criticizing Poland. At the same time, we deployed a artillery brigade to Germany that had not been there in the past, and nobody went to NATO or coordinated with Montenegro to ask if that was a good idea to put that artillery brigade, National Guard artillery brigade, in Germany. It was just done. Germany and the United States worked it out. NATO was notified. We think we need this here. We reinforced other units in Germany over the last several years as well. And those were not brought up as sort of larger NATO decisions. They were organized in a way as the U.S. response to the problems on the eastern flank, what we were doing in Germany, and also in other places, in Belgium and Netherlands, for example, putting pre-positioned equipment. That was, U.S. discussions with those countries that had those capabilities previously, these storage. We negotiated with them or renegotiated to use them, and we brought those in. And again, NATO was part of the discussion, but NATO was not making a decision on those. And so, this, in my view, it's the same thing out here. But because the main, I think, the main background topic here is a concern by Germany about how this looks vis-a-vis the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And there's still an effort by some in the alliance to want to adhere to the Western or the NATO view of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, in spite of the fact that the Russians have abrogated the document entirely. So I think that's what's more at play out here, and that's just uncomfortable. We have this sort of more recent member of NATO, not too recent anymore, but 1999, Poland's aboard, and now we're moving, forces for extended stays into the region, and it looks like Poland has it's all Poland's idea, and it's really not the case. And the U.S. and Poland came together on these concepts, let's say, to strengthen the eastern flank using Poland as sort of an anchor point, and that's where we are. So in my view, it strengthens NATO. It actually acts as a magnet to convince others in the alliance to participate more strongly in the region eastern flank, because we already know from history that generally when the U.S. is there, others feel more comfortable about joining, especially military missions. So that's part of it. So I think Poland and the United States working these out actually encourages NATO to do more on the flank.
Okay, well, thanks for clearing that up. Poland has, as you said, been a reliable and committed member of the alliance, and is one of the allies that commits the 2% spending of their GDP on defense, something that President Donald Trump is very adamant about, and something that we've been hearing about on the news more often than in the past. So this could be, Poland could be an example, as you said, for the rest of the allies to kind of be more committed to the efforts in the area. So some of the main themes of this podcast series are to talk about great power competition, the transatlantic relationship, and disinformation campaigns. And I like to ask everyone I interview about their perspectives on these major issues today, and kind of tie the questions into what they do for a living. So in your case, do you think that in this era of great power competition, that the US may prioritize the Asia Pacific at some point, and therefore leave somewhat of a vacuum in Europe for Russia to fill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the United States can't afford, for sure, turn its back on our allies and partners in the region, especially in this troubled period. But clearly, whether it's de facto or not, discount the bad terminology of the Asia pivot years ago, the United States has got to focus on the Asia theater. And so everything we can do as the United States and NATO to strengthen NATO interoperability, NATO capabilities, so that if the United States is pulled into a conflict into the Asian theater, whether it's a shooting war or something along close to it, that we have in place here the ability to hold the line, continue to deter Russia, whatever forces we have here. Now, clearly in the Asia theater, at least initial periods, more likely than not, naval, sea power, and air power will be the prominent forces required, unless we get into a shooting war somehow in Korea Peninsula. But with that, it does allow us to have some flexibility, maintain the sort of rotational ground forces that we continue to bring and focus on NATO's eastern flank. Of course, there's air power and sea power associated missions too. So to increase the chance of there not being a miscalculation, if the U.S. is focused in Asia, increase the chance that Putin does not make a miscalculation, it means the European pillar of security and defense has to be stronger. In order to do that, I think we need to get beyond the war of words of either brain dead NATO, or we need another army in NATO, the sort of French initiative. EU army kind of idea. There's nothing that's going to replace NATO as the preeminent security guarantor and military capable alliance in Europe. But anything below that the European Union does, for example, in military mobility, helping us get troops more quickly to the eastern flank, anything that individual countries or smaller format groups, whether it's PESCO, for example, they have a big project to deal with military mobility too. Anything that goes on in those spheres to strengthen the European pillar of defense and security, from our view, SEPA's view, my view personally, that's all good. But anything that undermines the coherence and cohesion of NATO, European initiatives that would say that we need to, reimagine NATO or do something different with NATO. That's wrongheaded, and we have a 75-year track record, or actually, I'm sorry, 70-year track record, 71, with NATO, and its really successful role as an alliance. And so, therefore, what we're doing now in interoperability training, huge training exercises, this new Defender series that started this year, for example, of bringing significant U.S. forces over to the region through Germany, other ports, and then into the region, was a little bit limited because of COVID-19, of course, but a lot was still accomplished with Defender 20. We're going to repeat that in 2021, U.S. leading a major allied effort in Defender 2021, focused more in the Southeast region, Black Sea, which is good. Back to the point you made, where we focus, Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and so forth. The idea of Defender is actually to alternate those two sub-theaters every other year to strengthen the interoperability and test all these movement networks that we have to test. So, but at the heart of it, there is the concern that the United States has a big job in Asia and it's growing. Besides, physical presence and military capabilities, we need to worry about in strengthening alliances in Asia. What we also need to do is to look at the Chinese threat, the Chinese government, the People's Republics, and President Xi efforts in Europe. Often forgotten as we talk about Russia and what's happening on the eastern flank and Russia undermining NATO cohesion and coherence, is the fact that the Chinese, not so overtly, but more in an economic way, are setting the stage for future political warfare with Europe and the United States, or dividing Europe from the United States. They have as many tentacles reaching into Europe and trying to separate allies from sort of the Western alliance system, whether it's 5G that we need to worry about, the threat of Chinese 5G, Huawei, and so forth, state-run companies, or this Belt and Road Initiative, which we're so happy to see the 3Cs initiative, which is not exactly a total counter to the Belt and Road, but it certainly is a way to strengthen allied and Western European connectivity and economic potential with this big Western initiative. So those kinds of things, besides the military strengthening NATO, EU military posture, defense and security capabilities, these economic, energy related infrastructure activities, for example, the 3Cs, are other ways that we need to increase the solidarity, cohesion, coherence of the West to thwart not just the Russia problem, but the geopolitical problem that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. These initiatives are vital for, the closer ties, because we can't risk to undermine the health and stability of the alliance and the relationship, especially these days when we're seeing the rise of other powers that risk to change or destabilize the Western-led international order and the values that founded that very order. And a few times you mentioned throughout this interview, this podcast, that the Russian threat is, it's in a kind of a hybrid form. So there's some propaganda going on, dissemination of propaganda, and kind of not direct military threats necessarily, but some other, basically, as I mentioned, hybrid threats. So would you be able to explain to the audience the threat of Russian disinformation for European security and what we can do together to counter that threat?
So on the propaganda, political warfare, disinfo level, significant threat. And the Russians have really been showing how capable they are at this. The Russians, if you listen to our Russia expert, Brian Whitmore, and then Don Jensen, formerly at CEPA. Don Jensen wrote a report about a year ago called "Chaos as Strategy," And basically, it talks about this sort of hybrid warfare campaign, and that how the disinfo political warfare is used at every single level, whether it's at this senior peer-to-peer level. You think about all the times that Putin's met with American leaders, and we have thought that we were going to turn the page on something, and it turns out we think one thing and the Russians do something else. That's one. Just the propaganda and face-to-face executive leader level. And then when we get down to the allies, dividing the allies up, and the most demonstrable remains this Nord Stream 2 problem, and this idea that somehow this is just an energy deal, and Germany being coaxed into looking the other way at all the political ramifications and all the energy security ramifications. That propaganda, that ability of Gazprom and the Russian political apparatus to sow doubt into what Nord Stream 2 is really all about, not just an energy deal, I think is significant, because when we have the most powerful, richest nation in Europe, Germany, falling to the Russian story on what Gazprom, or believing in spite of the reality. So it's significant. The threats by Russia, whether underneath or as part of the propaganda warfare or the disinfo, are significant, and it's divided. We have governments all over Europe with even within the governments mixed views on how to deal with Russia. I mean, just look at the two different sort of views in the Czech Republic, a key ally in Central Europe, and in the president prime minister kind of differences on how they look at Russia. Bulgaria, going back to the Black Sea, 3 allies and several partners. But we have 3 allies with very strong different views about Russia. Romania probably, is de facto the centerpiece for us in the Black Sea because of their political will, but not certainly for their military capability. It's great to see Romania trying to build and strengthen, and it's important. Geographically, they're in a key place, but really, Ukraine or Turkey, if they were both politically, in the case of Turkey, the strongest military in NATO, besides in Europe, the largest, should be on our front lines in the Black Sea. But really, there's a lot of a disagreement about how we're going to deal with Russia in the Black Sea. The Black Sea NATO Lake, the Russia Lake, the Neutral Lake, and so this is part of the Russian sort of underneath hybrid campaign, tying in Turk Stream 1, Turk Stream 2, big deals with Erdogan on air defense, and therefore they've convinced the Turks that they either need to balance their relationships with Russia and NATO, or that Russia is their better friend. I'm not sure which one, but again, referring to a General Hodges point, this is where we need to stand strong as NATO and sort of have a U.S.-NATO 2.0 reboot of our relationship with Turkey. How that goes and what the steps are, I can't tell you, but we need to do something because they're the essential ally in the Black Sea. So anyway, Russia's ability to use these tools, the propaganda, is significant. They've used it since 2014 very strongly. I've seen it very personally working in the embassy of what they've done to try to sow discord in the Polish government and the media by sending out disinformation about what's happening with our troops on the ground. For example, saying that some falsely accusing American soldiers of raping some Polish girl somewhere, getting into bar fights, that the Americans are here as occupiers, and all those kinds of stories. Thankfully, because the strong Polish-American alliance and Poland's great role in the West and NATO, the Poles generally don't buy into that. But there are other states in the region with Russian minorities, when we talk about the Baltics, that the Russians can use ethnic and their relationships with these minorities to also try to sow discord within the body politic of these states. So that's always a concern as well. There's some states that are more resilient and some that are not. So what needs to happen is all these organizations that are involved, whether it's the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, the Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Latvia, the Hybrid Center in Helsinki, all these different efforts by the EU or individual countries or NATO in our sort of review and study of what's happening with these things, they are not all sort of tied in together. This is a part of the democratic system. And because of our inability to sort of link all these efforts together and get more synergy out of them to counter Russia, we're back on our heels still in the propaganda war. So the Russians have made significant progress. We have started to stand up all these centers and started to stand up to be more offensive. But I think we need an even more offensive approach back to the sort of approach we had with the Cold War with Radio Free Europe, Voice of America approach to the Warsaw Pact. We don't have that coherent approach. I'll just give you one example and finish here, is in Belarus. There's very limited exposure by the Belarusians to Western style, precise, accurate media. And what has happened is the Russian outlets or the Belarusian outlets that are Russian supported, with all their glitz and glamour, are the ones that are attention is paid to in Belarus. Efforts like Belsat, which is a Polish UK partnership to get accurate news to the Belarusians in their language, is a great example of a positive effort, but it doesn't have the funding and the glitz and glamour of all the Russia Today and other kinds of things that the Belarusians are more apt to watch, and therefore it's not reaching a very big audience.
There are a variety of different threats that we need to look out for, and propaganda dissemination really risks to undermine the cohesion of the alliance and of the European Union and of the United States. And it's a very powerful tool. And as you said, we seem to be lagging behind the Russians and the Chinese in this area as of late. As you mentioned, Russia Today has a huge budget, incredible, almost like that of the BBC. I looked it up the other day. And then as we saw during the coronavirus pandemic, for example, so much dissemination of disinformation, that the Chinese are being so much more helpful than the West in certain regions of Europe, and portraying the West as completely absent and not helping anyone at all. It's challenging, but we certainly need to do or make efforts to counter that challenge and to change the narrative so that this narrative doesn't take over. So,
yes.
Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks again, Suzanne. Thanks for this great project you're organized. And all the best at George Marshall Center. Thousands of Poles have been trained there at this point, and all over the rest of the new, post-Soviet space have been sent or have been sent instructors on democratic practices and defense reform and so on and so forth, countering terrorism. So the work that the Marshall Center continues to do and that great German-American partnership is absolutely phenomenal. We need to keep strengthening that as well. That's another one of these lesser known efforts that's out there. There probably is a lot more potential. And again, I applaud your leadership in that German-Polish-American tri-lab. That's another example of something, kind of born out of the great Marshall Center. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for the promotional last couple of minutes. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in to Security in the 21st Century. And don't forget to tune in to the next episode.